Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of OHS Reps Live. My name's Bridget, I'm an OHS Safe Work Organiser at Trades Hall, and I'll be your host for tonight. I'm here with Dr. Carlo Caponecchia, who is a senior researcher and lecturer at UNSW and the current president of the International Association on Workplace Bullying and Harassment. And today we'll be having a discussion on workplace bullying. Before I get started, as always, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we're broadcasting. For me, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the mighty Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was stolen, never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Slater and Gordon, for supporting the live show. A lot of what we do here wouldn't be possible without their support, so I want to thank them. So tonight we're going to be talking about bullying. It's a hazard that can occur in any industry, any workplace, and it can be a pretty challenging one for reps to address. As always, we're going to be monitoring the Facebook comments. So if you have a burning question for Carlo, you can drop it in the comments and we'll be able to answer it live. Of course, please try to keep your questions general. We want to make sure that everything we're talking about here is informative and applicable for everybody listening. So if you need one-on-one support, if you're struggling with workplace bullying, you need that one-on-one support, please contact your union. Please get your union organizer out. They can give you that hands-on support that you need. Or you can go to our website, ohsrep.org.au, and you can submit a question through Ask Granada and get that personalised advice that's going to be tailored to the issue that you're facing. But for now, we want to keep it general, keep it informative for everybody. And yeah, with that said, Carlo, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us. You've done a lot of you've done a lot of work around psychosocial hazards at work. But do we want to start out with the basics? Do you want to give us an intro to bullying in the workplace, what it looks like, who it affects, that kind of thing?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining the webinar tonight. I'm here in Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So talking about bullying and some of the basics. Sorry, Bridget, you wanted to know what it is that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I guess a general intro, what is it, who it affects that?
Of research and workplace health and safety led practice in workplace bullying now for a very long time. And we're recognised as having done that internationally. Accordingly, we have pretty consistent criteria that are used around the country now. And many of you will be familiar with those three criteria. They're all very important, and they are that to be called bullying, behaviours have to be repeated, they have to be unreasonable in the circumstances, and we use the common unreasonable person test to assess that, and they have to create a risk to health and safety. So they're the main three criteria that we use when we're trying to assess whether something is workplace bullying or not. In terms of the effects that it can have on people, they can be many and wide-ranging depending on the nature of the. And so it can range from, worry and fear and anxiety through to sleeplessness. Nausea is a really common outcome. A lot of the cases that I work on, you'd be surprised how common it is for people to report feeling nauseous on the way to work. Often in the morning on the way to work, they're feeling nauseous. So I'm always surprised how commonly that one comes up. And of course, people can go on to develop mental disorders and think about suicide as well as complete suicide, unfortunately. So a really wide range of behaviours, and it really depends on the situation and what's being experienced.
Yeah, definitely. Something that I've heard is that interpersonal group of work cover claims. So it is, a really big issue that it impacts people in a really significant way. So one of the key characteristics that you just mentioned, the fact that it needs to be repeated behaviour. Is that something that you found is, a criteria that becomes an issue for people that are trying to prove that bullying is happening at their workplace?
It can be, but I think that sometimes it's useful to understand why the repeatedness criterion is there. It's essentially there to be a little bit conservative. The unreasonableness criterion is there to be a little bit conservative as well. It's to stop just getting reports from singular behaviours or singular experiences. It's also important to keep in mind that usually we interpret, but that you could have a number of behaviours that are forming a pattern, so that you've got a repeated set of behaviours. And then you've got to remember that you're not looking for one criteria, you've got to get all three. Okay, so you've got to have that unreasonableness criterion and the creating a risk to health and safety as well. I think the unreasonableness criterion is the one that people get a little more confused about. I think that it's sometimes a little harder for people to assess, whereas repetition is pretty easy. Repetition is greater than once, if you want to be really strict about it. But the unreasonableness can be a little more tricky.
Is that I guess making the distinction between being targeted and someone bullying you versus you've been acting up at work and you might be, copying a bit of disciplinary action from that? Is that what you mean by, unreasonable? Or
that could be a consideration that justifies or provides a reason for them being targeted. I wouldn't want to go down that line, but I see what you're saying there. But that's kind of my point of why that unreasonableness criterion is really tricky. So typically what I talk about when we're discussing unreasonableness is thinking about the behavior in the context. You've got to understand what the job is, who's doing the job, who's doing the tasks, who you're doing it with, what the nature of the industry is, and a range of similar contextual variables to understand whether it's reasonable or not. Remember that unreasonableness is about reasonableness with account of all the relevant circumstances. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's really hard because many of us work in jobs where, our family and our friends, and so it's hard to get someone to test the idea of whether it's reasonable or not. But it's important to be able to think about that context and think about things like, well, okay, this is happening to me. Is it happening to everyone else in the same way? That could be a useful little test. Is it happening to everyone else like that? And is it happening to everyone else like that all the time too? Or is it just me that it's happening all the time too? That can help you with that unreasonableness criterion. Another element there, sorry, just to cover this one off, another little test with unreasonableness is, so we talked about unfairness, but another one is whether it's sort of generally unacceptable. Is it generally offensive to everyone, which might make it unreasonable?
Yeah. So in terms of collecting evidence, is there any tips you've got for reps that are either maybe struggling to hit the repeated criteria or the other criteria of it being unreasonable? Do you have any tips for how to collect the right kind of documentation if you're trying to prove that kind of thing?
Sometimes people don't think about what the evidence could be, but it includes any kind of documentation, emails, text message, voicemail. Rosters are common to show patterns of work, for example. Diary notes are pretty common to record what might have been said that's not written down in documentation. They're kind of the main ones. People don't always think about recording those things, and you've got to be really careful about recording. Don't go and try and record someone without their knowledge. That's not going to be very useful either. So there are some people who don't think about what kinds of evidence might be available, and then there are others who collect everything, right? And sometimes that's as much of a problem, because what happens in situations like that is that if a person gets to a point where they feel that they have been exposed to bullying or whatever, of all the evidence, well, here's the evidence. And sadly, their experience is that they are sort of pushed aside because it's too much for anyone to deal with. And so you've got to find ways to sort through and organise that evidence if it's actually going to be effective evidence of anything.
Yeah, very true. And like establishing that, like if you've got that much evidence, it's, you know, or probably already pretty obvious to that it's a repeated pattern of behavior. It's just about kind of like rifling through, finding the like key points that, you know, really show what's been going on.
That's right. And so sometimes having lots of evidence that's maybe poorly organised can actually work against you because it's not telling a particular story. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah. While we're on the topic of evidence, I just wanted to bring up that I'm going to ask Davina, who is in the live show control center, to drop a link to the incident log so you can download the log. Some of you might have already downloaded it. I sent it around to our OHS network. But if you haven't already, you can follow the link, download the log, print it out, and it will give you a template of you know, a space to write down, you know, what happened, when it happened, who might have seen what happened, so that then if you're trying to build a case to show that workplace bullying is happening where you work, you'll have some evidence to back it up. And I think so. I guess the key thing that I've taken from the past, you know, the past couple minutes is that you're looking for. You can think outside the box in terms of what evidence you can collect, because you do want to show that it's repeated and that it's unreasonable, but to not go overboard. You want to make sure that there's a clear narrative and that you really want to make sure that the evidence you have supports what you're trying to show. So that link will be in the Facebook comments for people that are watching, and yeah, download it. It can be helpful if this is something that you're dealing with in your workplace. So I think we've got some questions coming in. Again, I want to remind people that we are monitoring the Facebook comments. So if you have a burning question, chuck it in the comments. Try and keep it general and we'll be able to answer it live. So the question we've got is, so what powers do Victorian HSRs have around workplace bullying and harassment? As this matter is more personal to workers affected than other workplace OHS issues, it could be hard to investigate matters. Is that so? Victorian HSRs, because you're trained in OHS, you can probably be a pretty good support when it comes to helping people file incident reports. You can consult with your employer about it. You have a right to sit on, say, a health and safety committee if this is something that your workmate is, you know, happy for you to bring up in a health and safety committee. That's something that you can bring up. Is there anything you might add to that in terms of like helping your workmate deal with an issue like this?
Yeah, well, I think that some of the things we've been talking about around evidence could be really important here. So I think there is a role in that support role to assist with evidence and to assist with assessing the criteria. So in some of the work that we've done, we've found that the criteria for bullying are often really quite difficult for people to use and in a way that that's reliable. Because the last thing that anyone wants is for people to say that they're being bullied when they're not. That's actually not good for anybody. It's not good for the person who is clearly going through something quite negative whatever it actually is. And we're going to talk about how it might be something else in a minute, I think. It's not good for them, not good for the workplace. It's not good for anyone who has to deal with it. So having a support role there to help people with those criteria is really useful. So being there and being able to be that sounding board to help them assess the unreasonableness of it can be really, really helpful. Having that, in some sense, disinterested but informed kind of place to go to get some support with that. Sometimes the best thing that you could do for someone is say, hang on a minute, maybe this is not quite bullying yet. Maybe this is something else. And maybe we need to look at that first. Acknowledging, of course, that there is really something going on that's potentially harming them for HSRs as well.
Yeah, definitely. So on that point, do you want to, so we mentioned before that, interpersonal conflict is, a huge driver of psychological injuries, but, interpersonal conflict isn't just bullying. So, I mean, how do we tell the difference between other forms of interpersonal conflict? Like, I mean, there's discrimination, there's organizational injustice, how do we tell the difference? And even, is it important to be able to tell the difference, which it seems like it is.
Yeah, I think it is. This is something that we did quite a bit of work on when we were sort of starting out in this field, because some years ago, and as I said at the beginning, there's a long history of this work particularly in Australia. And some years ago, when we were trying to grapple with this concept, and it wasn't well defined at all, and many would argue it's still not. We did some work on trying to say, well, how do we distinguish and how do we distinguish between things like bullying, harassment, discrimination, and violence? Because they often get tied up together. And that's because they can sometimes occur together. So they can all be going on in the same scenario. And that can be really, really tricky. But there can be different legal remedies, so different legal avenues that can be available to the people involved. For example, if it's bullying versus violence, well, violence you can pursue down the road of assault, right? And violence, of course, includes threats. So using, we typically use the ILO definitions of violence, workplace violence. And similarly for harassment, discrimination, there are different legal definitions there that can give you different avenues to go down. And sometimes you might need to make a decision about, and the lawyers often do this, about do we run this as bullying? Do we run this as harassment? Do we run this as discrimination? Do we run this as violence? So the distinctions actually do matter. And so trying to be clear about what's going on is important. That also means sometimes that that you might sort of have to concentrate on. It's not always acceptable to people, but it's another reason why we don't want to jump to necessarily calling it one thing or another. We want to get some advice and get some assistance on that.
Yeah. I think a while ago we made a flowchart that was trying to distinguish between organizational justice and bullying, and there were a lot of parallels, so it took kind of a number of levels to get between the two. And one of the other questions we've gotten is, I guess, kind of similar, is how do these matters get separated from a HR issue versus an OHS issue?
Yeah, it's a good one. Most times, it's a good question, but a difficult one. In some organisations, they are only treated as HR issues, and they're not seen as health and safety issues at all. Mm. And that has been a tension over many years as well, as to when viewing this as a OHS issue versus a HR issue. So a different framework comes with a different set of assumptions, a different set of practices. And so HR is the HR framework. I'm not talking about HR personnel in particular. I'm talking about the framework that they tend to use. Tends to be about resolution. It's about something's happened, let's resolve it as quickly as possible. Whereas an OHS framework on this issue is much more proactive and preventative and trying to control the sources of harm before they get to a point where people are harmed. So they're coming from different ends, and where a particular organisation approaches this issue from depends on their maturity, depends on their maturity in their safety management system, depends on their outlook, depends on their competencies in this area as well. I think things are changing a little bit. I now think that there's decreasing weight put on the idea that this is just HR. I think at least most people are saying it's both. And many of the things that have been happening recently are supporting this. As you know, we have action on the Boland Review recommendations now, which have meant that the WHS ministers across the nation have decided to put psychological health and safety into the reg, into the model reg, which is a really big development. Hasn't happened yet, but it's no doubt, well, I hope no doubt. So that's a really big recognition that this is under the WHS framework. We've been saying that for years, and we've got really good recognition of it. There's codes of practice that include this now in New South Wales. There's one being developed in Queensland. There's one being developed in WA, and there's a national one being developed. So everyone's jumping on this. And of course, the thing that I've been most involved in most recently, some years ago, I was involved in the National Guide on Workplace Bullying. But the thing I've been involved in most recently is the new international standard, ISO 45003, which is a safety management system-based standard for psychological health at work. And it is very much of the view that all of these kinds of issues, including bullying, harassment, violence, discrimination, all of those belong within a safety management system alongside you that says this is part of safety. And my advice to safety people is that these are hazards that you should know about as well as you know about noise and as well as you know about dusts. No excuses. You've got to know about all of the psych hazards, including bullying and harassment, violence, discrimination, etc. But all of the psych hazards, they are core business now, and you need to know about them so that you can get better outcomes around protecting people from those sources of harm.
Absolutely. And some of the HSRs...
Sorry, that was a bit of a soapbox. Sorry, Bridget.
No, it was a very interesting one. And some of the HSRs tuned in might remember a little while ago that we were campaigning for psychosocial regulations, and bullying is a big part of that. It's really interesting how some of these hazards, a lot of people don't really think about as hazards. Fatigue is a hazard, and stress is a hazard, and workload is a hazard, and bullying too it's an OHS issue. Everyone deserves to be safe at work, and that includes your mental health. If you're going home feeling really, really distressed, then you're not safe at work. And it's great that that's something that's been recognised more and more recently. So I might move to another question. So we've got a question. Hi, Dr. Carlo. Criteria?
Yeah, I think it does. Sadly, that's a common response. Well, maybe becoming less common with greater awareness of psychological health at work. But it does happen. I think it does go back to looking at the criteria. So if you are making the argument that what's happening to you is bullying, then being able to show evidence of those criteria can be really helpful with that. And so the way that you'd want to, and I can't know the details of that particular circumstance, but the way that I'd imagine you'd want to try and counter that is by saying, well, it's not just me, it's happening to a whole bunch of people, or this kind of behavior, yes, I'm the only one that's complaining about it, but generally in most industries, this is unacceptable. Those are the kinds of arguments that I think you'd want to be making there, and thinking about whether there are any other sort of stated policies, practices, procedures, values in that organisation that say that this is not okay. So I'd be pointing to those to say, well, it's not about me. So those are some thoughts there of the way that I'd be trying to argue around that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I hope that answers the question. Something that I'd like to get into is, I guess, the action that health and safety reps can take in their workplaces. And I mean, it seems like there's two issues that we need to deal with. There's the preventative and the reaction after you have a bullying complaint. So do we want to start with prevention? Are there, some key drivers of workplace bullying? Like, are there risk factors that we can look for, or maybe some red flags in workplaces that might indicate that, the stage is set for workplace bullying, if that makes sense?
Sure. One of the ways we've started to talk about this is to really place bullying within that context of psychosocial hazards. And by psychosocial hazards, I mean the things that are in the new standard, that are in the national guidance. So things like work overload, lack of job control, lack of management support, role conflict, role ambiguity, poor career development, those kinds of things that are accepted as hazards. And we add to that list to people is how bullying's a hazard. The behaviours are sources of harm, but they're also affected by all those other hazards. So they're more likely to, so bullying behaviours are more likely to happen in circumstances where you have those other hazards. So to answer that question, by attempting to control the risks that are presented by those other hazards of workload, of a lack of job control, of lack of support and supervision, and all those other ones, you can reduce the likelihood of bullying occurring as well. So that's one of the main things you can do. And in addition to that, attempting to have some controls around the typical bullying behaviours as well is also very useful.
Yeah, cool. Some of the HSRs tuning in might remember that so we have a HSR conference every year. I'm sure some people tuned in have probably attended it. Last year we did it specifically on psychological hazards, and we released a tool that was a psychological health survey tool that you could take into your workplace and ask your control and gendered violence and a whole range of risks, and we've still got that available. So I might ask Davina to link that in the comments. If that's something that's going to be helpful for you to take into your workplace, you can follow that link, and will probably help you identify some of those warning signs. So I guess more preventative policy type things. We're all about hazard controls. What kind of hazard controls would you say are, good to push for?
Yeah, I should have got to the controls. I focused on the hazards there. Sorry. Look, the key control when we talk about all of those hazards, the key control is work design. So work design and work redesign. So those hazards are controlled by, for example, with role conflict, well, provide or redesign the job description, review the job description and see if it needs to change. Ensuring that you're doing better consultation. That actually gives people more control. It gives people agency and gives people a say in how they do the work, when they do the work, who they do the work with. So control, consultation being the most powerful OH&S tool, really. Consultation can be really effective as a measure that helps to control some of those hazards. And as part of designing the way that work is done. So it's all part of work design. So that's really the key control. When it comes specifically to bullying, I mean, the kinds of things that people do is they have a policy around it, which can be important so long as it's implemented and so long as it's consistent and comprehensive and people know about it and people are trained in it. Gee, there's a lot of criteria forming for this policy now, right? But it's sometimes not done very well, even though it's the policy that most have. And then some of the controls tend to be more around the response, so after it's happened rather than being preventative. People do quite a bit of before and after. I think we've kind of moved away from that kind of awareness training that was really popular about 5 or 6 or 8 years ago. We've moved away from that a lot. I think it'll probably now be replaced with awareness training on sexual harassment. If I was going to make some predictions, that would be one of them. There will be multitudes of companies offering their wares on that. So yeah.
In terms of the hierarchy of control, training is a really low order control. It's an administrative one. So we're looking at second from the bottom. So if we're shooting for good hazard controls, we shouldn't be shooting for admin.
No, that's right.
Up the hierarchy.
And not only is it the bottom of the hierarchy, but it's usually really badly done. And it's never done with, I know that sometimes people feel that competency assessment is a bit of a dirty word, but it's never assessed usually what people can do after that training. However, the things we've been talking about in terms of work design are at the very top.
Absolutely. And back to the Psych Health survey, for people that have, done the survey, they would know this, but at the end of the survey, it'll help you identify those hazards and it'll give you a one-pager on possible controls that you can implement in your workplace. So if you're looking for, examples of controls for if the workload is too high in your workplace or there's, low job control, it'll give you some examples of hazard controls that you can ask for when you're consulting with your employer. When it comes to anti-bullying policies, obviously we're still looking at administrative controls, but it's one of the things that a lot of companies have when they're being written or when they're being changed. HSRs do have to be consulted. It's your right as a HSR to be consulted. So if there's reps watching that are being consulted or involved in helping write an anti-bullying policy, what are some of the things that they can look for or some things that would be good to push for in a good anti-bullying policy?
If you write them well, they can set up the expectations of what actually has to be in place. So you can use policy as a tool for ensuring that you have other more robust things in place because you put them in the policy. Now you've got to have them, right? So if you're careful, you can really make policy work for you. Basic policies, do the commitment to not having bullying. Some of them do zero tolerance, which I'm not very much a fan of, which I'm happy to take some questions on why. I don't think it's very useful for a range of reasons. So commitment, roles and responsibilities, outlining the reporting system of what to do if it happens to you. And hopefully that is consistent with your regular hazard reporting. That's ideally where I'd want it to be. It's often not. So I think that's something to sort of engineer if you're interested in making this part of safety alongside all the other psych hazards. Well, why aren't you reporting it in the same way? I think there's moves towards doing that, but slowly and gently. So you talk about, so the policy should say where you should report it. The policy should outline who should be trained in what and when, what training's available. It should say what support's available in terms of support in the workplace and support external to the workplace. So like things like employee assistance programs. But then I think more sophisticated policies might start talking about what you should expect after reporting these kinds of behaviours. This would show real commitment. And so it's really probably a bit unlikely. It's probably me being a bit with my head in the clouds now. But to talk about, well, when you report it, the responses are going to be timely, they're going to be appropriate, they're going to be handled with confidentiality, and maybe something about the limits to confidentiality, because there are limits. If it says to you that everything is going to be confidential, no, it's talking about the possible things that could happen, which could be anything from, we'll do an investigation, we'll try and see if mediation is important, but we should talk about mediation as well, just as a note. We'll do an investigation and we'll follow up from that, and we'll try and implement the recommendations and do continual improvement. So more sophisticated ones would be doing things like that. And those are things I think to be aiming for, which I think was your question, Bridget. What should we sort of be trying to say we could be doing in policy? I think those are some of the things.
Yeah, awesome. Before we move on, I just want to remind everyone watching that we're monitoring the Facebook comments again. So if you've just joined us and you've got a question, you can pop them in the Facebook comments and Carlo will be able to answer you live. So do we want to move more into what happens after you've got, a case of bullying in your workplace? So what kind of protection do we have from being bullied at work?
It varies depending on where you are and where you work, is the short answer. So in addition to the sort of the general duties under the Act, so in Victoria, there are the laws in the criminal laws under the stalking provisions that you could access in Fair Work Commission's anti-bullying jurisdiction. It's been a while since I've been involved in that, but you could have a look whether you're covered by that, and it depends on where you work. Whether you work for a non-government agency is one of the key things, and for that jurisdiction to apply, you've got to be still working, so it can't be sort of retrospective after you've left. So there are a few conditions around that. Yeah.
Cool. Hypothetical. So if you imagine that you're a health and safety rep, and a member of your designated work group has approached you, has said they feel like they're being treated unfairly, they feel like they're being targeted, you think it could be bullying, but you haven't quite established that yet. What do you do? What's the first step?
Okay, well, let's try and talk through this. What I would do if I was in that position. First, I'd just ask them what happened. So I'd try and find someone from that immediate environment, because I don't know what happened and who might be seeing that we're having a discussion about it. So I'd probably try and take them away somewhere private and quiet. And also, they're probably, when they're coming to you, they're probably a bit distressed. So I'd probably try and calm them down a bit, and then ask them some details about what happened. And I'd probably need to probe that a little bit to really understand what was happening. It's likely that I'm going to hear a whole range of things that happened, all out of order and all in a bit of a mess. And I'm not being disparaging there. It's reflecting the reality that this is a person who's in distress, and you're going to hear stuff that happened sort of all over the place. They're probably really upset. And so I'd be trying to make sense of that information, and probably later down the track, this is a bit of an initial assessment, but later down the track, some of the questions that I'd want to be asking them, and I maybe should have mentioned this before, but some of the questions I'd probably ask them are about look, lots of things happened to you. What was the most important one? What was the most important? If you had to just pick one that was the most important, that caused the most harm or caused the most distress, what was to get an understanding of what the real core of what's going on might be, and it gives you an early indication of which way you might need to pursue it. So I find that to be a really useful question. You might also, another question I find really useful, I know there's a lot of steps here, Bridget, but we're trying to step through it. Another question that you might ask is things like, there's usually a trigger event that has caused them to come to you. So the straw that broke the camel's back. Usually, if it really is bullying, this has been going on for a long time and they've been putting up with it and they've got to a point where they just can't bear it anymore. Understanding what that event was can be really useful. Sometimes it's a very small event and on the face of it seems like nothing. But that might be the first thing that's reported to you. And so it might get dismissed as nothing. But understanding that it was just that trigger event that triggered them to want to do something about it is important to understanding the whole context of it and how long it's been going on for. So that's just part of understanding what happened. Then from there, I'd go on to be thinking about what evidence might be available and whether you've got, and you'd make some decisions about what you do next, which might include talking to the person about what they want to do. Do they want to report it? How do they want to report it? Do they want some time off to have a think about it? They probably need some time off and time away, depending on how distressed they are about it and how they're feeling right now. So a lot of it depends on the situation, but those are some of the things that I'd consider in a scenario like that.
Yeah, I guess that's a really important point that when it comes to other hazards, you can kind of, as a HSR, kind of, I guess, use your own problem-solving skills and kind of take steps without that you think are right. But I guess when it comes to bullying, you've got to do what your workmate wants you to do. So so consent would be really key when you're dealing with something like this.
Yeah, some people will report and they will say, I don't want you to do anything with this, but I just want you to know. So that's pretty common. And
if someone said that, what would you do? Would you just sit on it or would you document it?
Depends what it was. If it was something that I felt was probably affecting other people as well and really badly affecting that person, then I'd probably want to take it further. It may also be, and organisations being reported to, and organisations always have the question of, well, they came to me, but they wanted to make an anonymous complaint and I can't do anything with anonymous complaints. No, not good enough. You have a duty to do something with that information where a risk has been identified. So even if you don't have a person's name on they say complaint, I tend to say report because it's more OHS language, right? Even if someone doesn't want to put their name to it, a risk's been identified and you've got to do something with that information. So there might be other ways to investigate what was going on. If it was happening to other people, there might be other data that you can access that can tell you about that. And it might just mean that you need to monitor things more actively. So you can't do nothing.
Yeah. That's a really good point, that you could, even if you're not making an incident report or going to conflict resolution meetings with your co-worker, that you can still do something meaningful. That was something else that I was thinking, that especially if the person you're talking to is comfortable with sharing their story, that it could be something that you could take to your designated work group and ask them if it's something that they've experienced, or even like, nobody wants to feel like they're in this by themselves. And if you can show them that they've got the support of their co-workers, or that other people are also experiencing it, that could also be something quite powerful you can do as a HSR.
Yeah, and sometimes these reports are not unexpected. I mean, the report might be unexpected, but you might know that there are some cultural issues in that work group, right? You might know that there's been some tensions between particular workers or around particular issues. So it may not be completely out of the blue. And so some of that work that you might do proactively to sort of look for some of those other hazards in the workplace that might be more likely to give rise to claims of bullying or discrimination or harassment or whatever it is, might actually be useful in, stopping you from getting to that report.
Mm.
Or provide information that you can use once you do have a report.
Yeah, I was going to say, on the flip side, if you've got someone who does want to take it that step further and file the incident report and I guess go through the complaints process that your workplace has, I mean, what would you do to support that, or what steps or what advice, I guess, would you have for someone going through that?
Yeah, look, it depends on your role. So I'll try and be as general as I can. I think that for most people making a report like this, and indeed for most people making a report about any kind of injury, no matter what the hazard is, I know we always want to draw a distinction between psych and everything else, and that's kind of really old school. Let's stop doing that. It's all part of the same thing. They're all hazards at the time. It's the first time they've been injured, hopefully. I mean, with some exceptions, right? It's the first time they've done it. They don't know what happens next. So I had a colleague that slipped over in the car park and sprained her wrist this year. She'd never been injured at work before. She had no idea of what happens next or who to call. People don't know this stuff, right? And so it's the same when people put in a claim of bullying or any other related behaviour. They don't know what's going to happen next. So trying to demystify the process, I think, could be really one of the most important things that HSRs could be involved in, and the union movement more generally. Helping people understand what should happen is really, really important, because it just reduces that anxiety level of the uncertainty of not knowing. What am I supposed to do? Who am I supposed to call? Do I have time off? Are people allowed to call me when I'm having time off? What do they call me for? All those kinds of questions. Do I have to go to my doctor? Do I have to go to a different doctor? All those kinds of things of what happens next, people really need support with, and I think would be much appreciated and reduce those anxiety levels. Being injured, being off work for any reason can be extremely stressful. And so being able to support people through that process is really important.
And
in addition to that, sorry, Bridget, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say something that HSRs would have heard in their training and would be quite familiar with.
Yeah, that's such important support. And then in terms of the processes around bullying and harassment, if the organisation is proposing to do conflict resolution or investigation, trying to help understand how those processes are going to work, and they're going to be different in different organisations, but trying to get as much information about how they might work, when they're going to be, what's allowed to happen, what's not allowed to happen, things like having a support person present, just having that person as an advocate to understand that process, and maybe even being the person who says, hang on a minute, there's no process for this. What's going to happen? A lot of organisations haven't done this before either. And so having someone to say, well, you should kind of let people know what's going to happen in advance, partly so that they can be prepared, but partly also so that the uncertainty and the anxiety of it is reduced. So we know that the process of dealing with a report, like on both sides of a dispute, during that process. So if there's
Before we keep chatting about this, I just want to say that we're getting to the end of our time with Carlo. So if there's a question that you've been sitting on for a little while, drop it in the comments now so we can answer it for you in the last couple minutes that we have. We had a question about what HSRs can do to support workers while they're reporting it, which we just answered.
Yeah.
I guess the next question that I had was, once you've reported bullying and you're going through the conflict resolution process, what would you say that you can reasonably expect from your employer?
Well, I think some of the things we've just been talking about having an understanding of what the process is going to be, I think it's reasonable to expect that they'll be able to tell you what might happen, not what will happen, but what are the options for what could happen, which might include, if it's behaviours of this nature, it might include investigation. If it's of this nature, it'll include something else. And if it's investigation, will it be internal? Will it be external? What will that process look like? Will that be at work? Will it be at some lawyer's office? All of those kinds of things about what's going to happen next, and the timeliness of that, reasonable expectation. So the notion of, sometimes investigations can take a really long time and people have no communication about what's going on. So even expecting that there'll be some communication, even if there's nothing to report, even if there's no progress, a phone call that says, we're at this stage, there's no more progress from when I last spoke to you, but we're moving on. Well, yeah, this is where we're up to. That can be really useful, again, to sort of make sure everyone's feeling respected and that they don't have to be increasingly anxious about what's going on. I think that's reasonable to expect. I think people, will the report be available? Will it not be available? I think it's reasonable to know that. And things like the process for selecting an investigator or a mediator. So knowing about that and knowing if there's any ability for the parties to have a role in that, or to understand how that might be randomized or how conflicts of interest might be managed. I think that's reasonable as well. I think it's also reasonable to expect that on return to work, that you expect that the risks to you and to everyone else will be managed because you're back at work, and the work has changed necessarily. You might be doing different tasks, you might be doing the same tasks. But organisations often expect, after an investigation, which has had a null finding, which has said, oh, nothing's substantiated, because that's the most common finding, right? That, okay, nothing happened. It was unsubstantiated, so nothing happened, so just go back to work. Everything's changed. Someone was really hurt. Probably more than one person was really hurt, right? These scenarios are really damaging for everyone. And off you go. Get back to work now. Those risks need to be managed, and some rehabilitation and repair needs to happen. And I think it's reasonable to expect that. And it's reasonable to expect that because you're at work and you're supposed to be provided a safe system of work.
I mean, are there many options for HSRs to escalate something if that happens? If a report comes back and says nothing's substantiated, so we're not going to do anything?
It's a really tricky one because you get into some really murky legal territory there. Sometimes reports are protected under privilege, are held under privilege, and so they're not provided even to the parties that are involved for a whole range of reasons. And the legal opinion on that, I'm no lawyer, but the legal opinion on that, as I understand it, is really divided. So it depends on the circumstances. Knowing what the outcome might be or having any details from the investigation, the HSR can be advocating for continual improvement and for repair. So the HSR will know about what's been alleged. And whether the allegations are substantiated or not, something's happened. Something's gone wrong. Doesn't matter what you call it. Something happened. Might be in different levels of seriousness. Something's gone on, and you have information that that's gone on, and you can act on that information to make sure that there's improvement in future. That's part of managing the risks to the people who may or may not be coming back to that workplace, but managing the risks for the people who are still there. So there's lots for HSRs to do.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good point of like a really powerful role that HSRs can play is not letting it just completely slide off the radar, because HSRs, you can work with other HSR, something that's being considered and action is being taken, even if the report comes back and that specifically isn't something that's going to go further.
That's right. And you don't have to have specific reference to that particular case. So you could say that, okay, we need to do some preventative work to manage the hazards of X, Y, and Z that might have been relevant in that case, without even referring to the case.
Yeah, awesome. Well, on that note, I think we've run out of time, so I might wrap it up there, unless there's any final thoughts you want to leave us with, Carlo?
I think that's kind of wraps it in a bow nicely. We've come full circle from what is it to dealing with some reports, and so hopefully there was some useful information there for everyone.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for giving up your evening to talk to us. It was really informative, and we really appreciate you giving up your time. For everyone who's tuned in across Melbourne and across the rest of Victoria,